And welcome everybody to the ABT Time podcast, coming at you live from, not so live, recorded from California, where it's 3:00 in the afternoon, which means it is 8 in the morning in Melbourne, Australia, home of our wonderful co-host, Dr. Jen Martin. Good morning, Jen.
Good morning, except that it's actually 9 a.m. now, Randy. Because of daylight savings switching here, you're going to have to change your spiel. Sorry.
You and your crazy daylight savings stuff down there.
I think we've got 5 different time zones in Australia currently. Everyone just really loves it. We think it's just terrific.
Nice. Okay, we got a wonderful guest today, as always. And Dr. Maryanne Garry, cognitive psychology professor from the University of Waikato in Hamilton, New Zealand. 2 years ago, Jade Lovell and I went there and spent a week running story circles with Maryanne and her whole group there. And Maryanne, you want to join us? We will do our introductions for you as we go along. I'll ask you to answer some questions about your background, things of that sort. There you are. And
hi.
Good morning. It's also morning there in Hamilton, right? 11?
Yes, it's 11.
Okay.
It's 11
all right.
02.
All right. First off, you got some answering to do here to start with. This is your Twitter bio, in which you tell us that the Sunday, December 27th mini crossword. Wait a second. Your handle there is Dr. Lamb Chop. And then you tell us about the crossword puzzle had an erroneous answer for the clue for 5 down. The first puppet to testify before Congress was Lamb Chop during testimony by Sherry Lewis in 1993. Can you please
Followed by a string. Yeah. Yes. I mean, that was the first puppet, though. But we've had a string of them under the Trump administration.
Oh, that's the context that's the relevance of this. I got you. Okay. Leave it to a psychologist to have a deep subtext.
Well, I've just always had a thing for sheep, not in that way.
Okay. All right.
You know, you Australians, steady.
I thought this was more about Elmo and that somebody had misrepresented Elmo and his fame, but okay. And how about Sicilian Buddhists? Can you fill us in on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I grew up in a family with that first generation Italian American, Sicilian American. So I learned a lot of, let's just say, that kind of thinking. So The Sopranos was more of a documentary for me, a lot of it. Not the extreme end, but kind of like, doesn't everyone buy things out of a van? Yeah.
And what part of New Jersey did you grow up in?
Oh, it's Cherry Hill, New Jersey.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And then give us a little brief summary of your background. Where did you do your graduate work?
I got my PhD at the University of Connecticut. It was a joint program with educational psychology and cognitive psychology. The idea was that the way that we learn is independent of where we learn it, right? So it's not like learning takes place out of a classroom, it takes place everywhere. And then I became really interested in things to do with the law and did a postdoc at the University of Washington after that with Elizabeth Loftus, who's probably the most famous person in the field of memory distortions ever. By some metrics, the highest ranking woman psychologist of the 20th century, right? You know, so
and that's a major part of your work is false memories. Is that right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is.
Right. Yeah. Great. Okie dokie. All right, let's see. Jade is only with us for a few minutes. Jade, why don't you join us, because I got to get into some more details here. So Jade Lovell, who's been in several previous episodes of the podcast, coming also to us from Melbourne, Australia. And 2 years ago, Maryanne invited Jade and me to come there and run our Story Circles narrative training. The first thing that we did was visit my old buddy, Lynn Devantier, who you see in this photo, who lives down the lower left corner of North Island. He and I were postdoctoral fellows at the Australian Institute of Marine Science a long, long time ago. He's a coral reef ecologist, and that's his wonderful wife, Catherine, and his daughter, Kim. They live in a little 15-acre farmlet there and just outside of New Plymouth. And so Jade and I spent a day there. Then we went up north and joined you guys to run we did 2 circles that we set up there that then ran for the next 10 1-hour sessions after we departed. And you guys dug in deep. And then this is our little group photo there, for which you gave me this wonderful gift, which was these amazing casts of bivalves that were so accurate you can identify them to the species level. Of course, I had to put the limpet on Jade's head. And, I've forgotten the names. Can you tell us who's in this photo here, Maryanne?
Yeah. Anna Sutton, Teresa Savitska, there's Devin Polaschek, Miva Sanson, and me.
Yay. Okey-dokey.
All too close to each other, right?
So we had a wonderful time there. And now we're going to dive into today's topic. And some of it, I think you and I are going to agree on. Other things, you're probably going to get annoyed with me. And as a result, I just want to introduce 3 terms that I will call acceptable terminology for you to use in addressing me. First of which is shut up. You're welcome to tell me shut up at any point you want along the way. Second is stupid. You're welcome to say that's a stupid idea. And the third one is shut up, stupid. You're also welcome to use that if you feel the need.
Right.
I won't be offended by any of these terms as we get going. And what I want to do now is there's 3 articles here that I want to just present a few little excerpts from them. These are going to kind of sow the seeds for our discussion. The first of which is this article that I have worshiped for 8 years, and I've cited it in my books and articles that I write, from Adam Gopnik in the New Yorker, because my feeling is that a lot of these patterns should remain null until really well proven. And there's been a tendency, especially among journalists with neurophysiology, to tell big stories off of tiny little pieces of information. That's what he addressed in this. And let's see, I'm gonna have to move this to be able to read some of these quotes. But here's what he said. Here's a couple little these excerpts. He said, writers on the brain and the mind tend to divide into Spocks and Kirks, either embracing the idea that consciousness can be located in a web of brain tissue or debunking it. For the past decade, at least, the Spocks have been running the enterprise. There are books on your brain and music, books on your brain and storytelling, which I put into red there, books that tell you why your brain makes you want to join the army, and books that explain why you wish that Bar Raffaelli were in the barracks with you. I had to Google her name. Turns out she is a supermodel from Israel, 36 years old. And I think that Adam Gopnik might be Israeli himself. One little relevant anecdote to share here. This is kind of offensive on my part, but last week, Park Howell, my good buddy from the business world, we got into a little unfortunate incident here with an author, which is there's this book published or written by Will Storr from the UK titled The Science of Storytelling. Came out, I think, a year ago or so. It's very popular, way more popular than my books. I think he's a writer with The Guardian. And somewhere in the last 3 or so months, I think I was on somebody's podcast. We can't figure out where this came from, but somewhere somebody, I think on a podcast, asked me if I read this. And I said, no, but it looks like a stupid book based on the title. Last week, Park wrote to Will Storr, who he had as a guest on his podcast, and asked him if he would write a review for our Amazon page. And Will wrote back and said, I'm not going to review a book where your lead author called my book stupid. And that was kind of a shock to me because I had no recollection of that. But that said, I will now explain in a few details why I did call this book stupid and stick to that, which is this title, The Science of Storytelling, matches exactly what's in red there, books of your brain on storytelling. And I'm willing to guess that probably the marketing people at the publishing house came up with that title. And why would they come up with that title? Because go to any newsstand and you will see 1, 2, or 3 magazines with articles on the cover that say the science of dating, the science of love, the science of makeup, the science of everything, the science of camping, the science of you name it. It is just a buzz phrase that people buy things based on because everybody wants to know what's the secret science behind all this stuff. And the answer is there is no science of storytelling yet. There's a few little anecdotes, bits and pieces, but not nearly enough to justify titling an entire book, The Science of Storytelling. And it sends this very sort of signal that Adam Gopnik was talking about in this article. He goes on to say, the neurological turn has become the cultural turn, or what the cultural turn was a few decades ago, the all-purpose non-explanation explanation of everything. 30 years ago, you could feel loftily significant by attaching the word culture to anything you wanted to inspect. We didn't live in a violent country. We lived in a culture of violence. We didn't have sharp political differences. We lived in a culture of complaint, and so on. In those days, Time magazine, taking up the American pursuit of pleasure, praised Christopher Lash's The Culture of Narcissism. Now Time magazine has a cover story on happiness and asks whether we are hardwired to pursue it. That's exactly right. It is a fad and a trend, the science of everything. He goes on to talk about the 1800s practice of phrenology, and that was nicknamed bumpology, the idea of looking at bumps on people's skulls and being able to infer their intelligence or whatever based on that. And then what he talks about is how much of this neuroscience, neurophysiology, it just keeps getting disproven and reversed and things like that. There's so much noise in it. And here's one of the excerpts. He says, there was the left right brain split, which insisted on a far neater break within our heads. Spock bits to the left, Kirk bits to the right, then is now believed to exist. So you hear people grabbing on, oh, right brain, left brain. And what they're saying is, sorry, the science is just more complicated than that. So I love that article for pushing the neuro-skepticism perspective. And then this other article that came out, and this is why I love the New Yorker so much. Some of their articles are off the mark, but others are just like they pull an arrow out and shoot it at a target and hit a bullseye. And I love this one last spring, The Rise of Therapy Speak, how language got off the couch and into the world. And it talked about how much common usage there is nowadays of all the stuff that comes from the psychology world. That's always bugged me. Here's a couple excerpts from that. There's a reason that the most fluent speakers of the trending argot, referring to therapy speak, tend to be wealthy and white. The language of suffering often finds its way into the mouths of those who suffer the least. I think that is so accurate. It is so characteristic. And then quotes from Lori Gottlieb, the author of the book, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. The downsides of casual therapy speak are more straightforward. Quote, I want to be clear that there's no reason why people who are not professional psychologists should be expected to use these terms correctly. Last Friday, Maryanne and I had an hour-long chat, and in there we talked a little bit about, she talked about people that misuse these terms, and especially the word cognitive is constantly misused. Here's another quote from that article. Using these words as bludgeons strips them of complexity. The problem with armchair therapy, or what we might now call Instagram therapy, is that it can transform a deeply relational, nuanced, contextual process, Gottlieb said, into something ego-directed, as if the point were always, quote, I'm the most important person. I need to take care of myself. Now, on that note, just 2 nights ago on Bill Maher's show, his guest was Steven Pinker. And, he's a great guy. He's really smart. And he was talking about rationality. His new book is titled Rationality. But here's the deal. I want to play just a little 20-second excerpt of the audio of him talking. And let's just play it here, and then I'll give my commentary on it. Hopefully you can all hear this. Matt, if you can't hear it, you got to lean forward a little bit. The audio is a little bit low, but let's listen here.
They think that nuclear is more dangerous than coal. But speaking to your point about stupidity versus ignorance, there's also bias, and there is a correlation between intelligence and being resistant to classic cognitive fallacies and biases, like the gambler's fallacy and the sunk cost fallacy and so on. They're not perfectly correlated. And there's some biases that have no correlation with intelligence, in particular the my side bias. Namely, you steer your reasoning toward the conclusion that you want to be true in the first place, and that's usually one of the sacred beliefs or talking points of your tribe, your clan, your political coalition, your sect. And that's one of the biases that smart people are as vulnerable as dumb. Well,
Okay, that's as much as we need to hear that. Let me give you my take on that. Is I don't understand anything he's talking about in there. I know it's all cool buzzwords about cognitive and bias and fallacies and all these sorts of things, but I think it's a lot of complicated concepts strung one after another to a broad audience that is dazzled by the complexity of it. But I guarantee if you quiz that studio audience, less than 5% really understood what the hell he's talking about. That's what bugs me. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm stupid, but that's my complaint about that stuff. And last little thing to touch on here, Maryanne, I talked a little bit about the media world of today. And actually tomorrow I'm going to be on Andy Revkin's podcast. And what I'll be talking about is the information maelstrom, a term that Marshall McLuhan coined in his final years in the late 70s. And the idea that someday we would hit a point where we've got so much information in our society, it's just turned into a maelstrom going all over the place. And my belief that we're there now, we've got almost as much misinformation matching up against information. Nobody can make sense of anything. What Maryanne pointed out and sent this paper to us was Marsha K. Johnson, prominent psychologist, in 2007 had this paper and others talking about the same basic thing, reality monitoring and the media trying to figure out how do you actually hold the media's feet to the fire and figure out what's right and what's wrong. In there, this is our word for today, veridic. And now, Jen, Can you define this word for me? Veridicality?
Randy, you can't even pronounce it. Why the hell would I be able to define it?
Exactly. I mean, we can kind of roughly veritas, it's something to do with the truth. And in fact,
Yeah.
I searched it in, sure enough, that it's the truth of an utterance. It's a beautiful word, veridicality. Maybe Maryanne uses it on a daily basis, not so much me.
Nor me.
And then in the first paragraph of that paper, she posed the question, why then should psychologists be interested in the media in particular? My answer to that is because the media has got infinite potential to tell all kinds of complicated things about it. And that then is my last little slide here, which is here's our topic for today, a plea for simplicity in psychology. And that's maybe my starting point with you, Maryanne, is there ever any discussion of the idea of simplicity in the world of psychology? I'm going to stop the slide sharing here. Can we start with that question?
I want to start with another question or another statement, which is that it is very easy, and I think you've done it. It's very easy for people who don't work in psychology to conflate all kinds of psychology, right? So there is what's called psychological science, which is a behavioral science, and that's what I do, right? There is psychotherapy, and then there's things that get tossed in a basket and get called psychology, which is like psychiatry, psychoanalysis, counseling, all kinds of things that are, depending on where you live, anywhere from sort of regulated to not regulated, and then let alone what happens from a pastor or a rabbi or whatever, right? So, what do you want simplified? Do you want therapy simplified? Do you want?
Well, I think I want to ask the first question is there ever any discussion about whether there's any cost to addressing things in their most complicated state?
Yeah. In fact, I think that's probably an area of study in psychological science. So,
but wait a second. Now let's make a distinction between an area of study versus a practical goal, which is let's try and make our knowledge a little more understandable through simplicity.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So then I guess, yes, sure. It depends what the audience is that you're talking to. So if you're writing for your own group, right? Everybody does this. You speak in, you've got word limits, you've got this, you speak in shorthand and code and jargon, blah, 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 blah. Okay. If the idea is about translation to quote unquote end users or somebody who might benefit from learning about the stuff. Yeah. So for instance, I'll give you two examples. And one is I chair an open science committee for the biggest organization of psychological scientists in the world, which is the Association of Psychological Science. And we are really pushing, because this is part of this worldwide trend, right? We're really pushing to make our science not just more accessible to scientists, but more accessible to everybody. So it's about how we have journals that they've been around for a wee while now, but that are designed to appeal not just to people who do the actual science, but they're written so that undergraduates can understand them, or even, undergraduates in a variety of areas. And then even the journal goes out to people who work in the US Congress, for example. So people who might be in a position to be making policy, and they're written in a way that tries to really remove the jargon and explain what the fundamental point is. Now, you might think that they don't do a good job, and they probably do jobs to varying degrees of goodness. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, in the same society, in the same big organization, we've got a big, I guess I would call it, I think they're calling it like a worldwide global or something, COVID initiative, something. But it's basically, we're going to hold these forums in which just people who want to ask questions and say, what do we need to know? Here's what I don't understand from a psychology, or what they think is a psychology point of view about what happened with COVID. Why are people so upset about masks? And why are people so upset about this? Why can't we get this done? Ask us questions, and we can then try and explain to them how the science matters for them. So this is a long, rambly way of answering your question, but I think really it depends on who your audience is.
And
Well,
Maryanne, is there
no problem.
pushback? So all the professionals in this organisation who are being asked to either partake in these symposia or being asked to write articles without jargon, is there wide, are people excited about that? Are they upset about that? Do they see the need? Do they think it should be a science communicator's job rather than their job? Like what's, obviously there'll be a spectrum, but how are most people responding?
Yeah, actually, one of the founding missions of this organization 30 some odd years ago was based on a quote by a guy a famous cognitive scientist named George Miller, who won the Presidential Medal of Freedom, I think. And he said, we have to be in the business of giving psychology away in the public interest. And that's the founding motto of this society. So sure, there are people who are driven by their own egos and just want to say what they want to say and have things named after them. But really, the mission of this organization has been for a long time to try and give psychology away in the public interest.
Okay, so we'll start to enter into topics that you're welcome to tell me shut up on. But I'm very kind of distressed at the patterns of today on the communication of all aspects of science. And in this country right now, we have over 700,000 people dead from the pandemic. There's kind of widespread agreement that at least 200,000 of those died as a result of misinformation and, failure to get people to understand these sorts of things. There's only one prominent epidemiologist scientist in the media that I've heard who's talked at all about the issue of they've done a terrible job communicating it. That's Michael Osterholm. I've been working with him for a year. Everyone else just assumes that we all communicate really well. The challenge is we've got to get better vaccines or whatever. And we've got to just basically shout this information louder rather than different. And even this term jargon, that misses the point. There's nothing wrong with jargon. Jargon put into a proper narrative context is the most powerful tool of all. If you know how to enter into a narrative with simple language that you can lead people into something that eventually builds to the really complex term, that's the bullseye. And yet when you hear all these people talking about communication, we've got to weed all the jargon out. It's not, you're missing the point by doing that. You kind of forest for the trees. And so I just don't see any of these science organizations really quite addressing, again, my field, the number one need is simplicity as a mindset. And when I try to talk about simplicity, academic scientists I run into just say, well, you're stupid. Basically they equate that with you're talking about dumbing things down. They really don't seem to be able to get beyond that. And I'm interested in your thoughts on this because you've done the story circles course with us. You've heard us talk about the ABT and all that sort of stuff. Do you see the people in the psychological sciences grasping this idea of finding simplicity through the structure of how information is put together rather than the individual words?
Yeah, there's a very long tradition. Well, some people, right? Some people. And actually because there is an area of psychological science that lends itself to this kind of thinking and almost dispositionally. And it's I would say that I work kind of in that area. I think that if you work in another area where maybe you study, dog behavior, or you study the behavior of people in complicated groups, then maybe you don't know this research as well, and it doesn't come as easily to you. I think the thing about jargon is important because I could have the best structure in the world, and if I'm using a phrase over and over again that you don't understand, I'm alienating you.
Well, so you're not following ABT basic structure if you're doing that, because
but you just said I could have jargon in something and still follow the structure and you don't understand it. And I just think if I use jargon.
No, wait, hang on. Before we go any further, let's clarify that, which is jargon used in the right place narratively, which means you open a narrative with agreement with the and material, and you don't open it with jargon because that's got its own narrative to it. But you slowly lead an audience in, giving them the tools they need to eventually understand this very complicated piece of jargon, and you work your way to it narratively. That's what I'm not seeing taught. I see all of these websites and workshops and things, and that's a blanket rule. Try to avoid using jargon. That just misses the whole point, I think.
But that's not Well, there, I think you're conflating two things. One is, do you use jargon, or do you teach and then use the jargon to point to what you just taught? Right. Those are two different things.
No, you use it's very parallel to, we did a wonderful episode a month and a half ago with Bruce Block, a famous professor at USC who's taught visual expression since 1977. And the core principle of his entire teaching is there are all these incredible tools of visual expression, the 7 elements that he talked to us about: line, shape, form, color, tone, movement, blah, 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 whatever they are. And they're all really great, but all of them have to be used in support of the narrative. And if you're not sensitive to what the narrative is, if you're just throwing crazy, wild camera movements at the beginning of your film because it's really dazzling, then you're undermining the entire process. And I think I would say the same thing about jargon, which is jargon is just like these elements of visual expression. It can be really powerful, but it must always be used in support of the narrative structure. And this is what I'm seeing, an absence of any discussion in this communication of science, is really that basic principle. That's why it was so fun to have Bruce Block as a guest, to have him articulate that, of how they try and then that gets ignored as well in the film world. You see these films that are all dazzling visual things, and then the story doesn't make any sense at all, but it's, it's visually stunning. So that's my parallel. And by the way, I'm making this up as I go along. It's just,
Andy, can I ask you something?
Yes.
Because you and I haven't actually had this discussion before, and I'm really interested in it. So you said it's basically, the best thing ever if you can use jargon, because, that shows that you've got your narrative structure right. I've kind of paraphrased that, but why is it so much better? Is that because you feel that it's beneficial that your audience has learned new language, or because you feel you can't accurately express your ideas as deeply as you would like to without using that language? Like, I do understand what you're saying, and I partly agree, but I'm just wondering, why is getting jargon in there better if you can be what Maryanne would say, which is more inclusive, and get the same material across to your audience without the jargon? Why is it better?
No, I didn't say it's better. I said it's a potentially powerful tool that you don't want to rule out. So let me draw that parallel. And again, I'm just making this up off the top of my head. I hadn't even thought about Bruce Block's relevance to all this, but it's absolutely relevant. For example, in film school, we had to watch the film A Touch of Evil several times, one of Hitchcock's greatest films. And that film builds, and it's all shot in flat space. There's nothing that deeply visually interesting until the climax scene where they finally reveal the murderer. And that one scene is suddenly in 3-dimensional deep space. And that change in visual perspective, save for that moment, ba-boom, hits you with, there's the moment. Oh my God, it all comes together. And it's adding one more element to the story has brought us to that as the payoff. And then we visually paid it off there. And I'm saying that same potential exists for jargon at all different scales, which is, if you develop this understanding of narrative, then you realize that one complicated term presented really well, where you've laid the groundwork down there where everybody can understand it when you finally get to it. And then you say, and by the way, the term is veridicality, or whatever that was term we had early on. If you've given us the story that leads to it, then that is the prize that you take away that has a deep understanding to it. But on the other hand, if you've thrown it into the very beginning of everything, you've just, confused people. So that's what I'm pleading for, is a deeper understanding of this term jargon, because all I see is this blanket belief that we must get rid of jargon. And that doesn't help anything. That's genuinely dumbing things down, where we're just going to go with all these simple words. You're never going to get anybody any depth, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, I agree with that. I mean, jargon is only jargon when it's used in the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't think you can ever define something as always being jargon. I totally agree with you. I'm just trying to get my head around. I understand with the movie example, with the Hitchcock example, that someone is then suddenly transported into a completely different sphere of understanding. Yeah. I'm just trying to get my head around the difference, where the power potentially lies. If in either end scenario, your audience deeply understands the topic, is it inherently better if they've learned a complicated word or not? And I guess without going through specific examples, I'd have to think about it.
I have a question for you. Do we have a guest on this episode? Sorry.
Yeah, maybe. Sorry, Maryanne. But Maryanne, what do you think? Because Maryanne, what do you
I'm sad that I think that perhaps Randy and I are not disagreeing as much as I thought we were.
No, dang, come on, keep pushing it. I want to get one good shut up out of you, so keep going.
Because I think that scientists who are going to adopt a lot of jargon typically tend to be the scientists who don't really work with narrative, right? I just think these are kind of a basket of bad practices. I think it's easy to hide behind jargon. It obfuscates things. And I think it's easy then to not have any kind of sense of pacing or narrative or, much, not even an understanding of your audience.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, I think I told you when we were talking last week, little kids go through this developmental stage where when they want to show you a picture, they're looking at it, right? Because they don't know that you can't. They're not.
I love that.
Right. They're like, oh, hey, look at my picture. And you're like, I have no idea what that is. Right. Oh, here. Right. And so this is the problem in science. Is like there are a lot of scientists who are going like this. Look at my beautiful ideas and not turning them around and crafting them so that you understand.
Yeah.
100%.
This thing, can we talk about this this Gopnik?
Yes.
Neuro-skepticism. So I guess I have two things to say. Broadly, in neuroscience, look, like we can't even define in psychological science what it means, even in the neuroscientific community. We can't even operationalize, as we say in science, right? What it means to show interest. What does that mean? What does engaging mean? What's a story? Let alone find where it lives in the brain or what's activated. That is preposterous. It's just preposterous, right? So it's too complicated for now because we can't even agree what it is. And so if you don't agree what it is, you don't know how to go find the thing.
All right. So at the risk of
thing I would say is,
yes.
What would even a science of storytelling look like? What does that even mean? I don't even know how to parse that.
Yeah, there you go. Doesn't it sound stupid to you? Oops, I'm not putting words in your mouth. But no, you're right, exactly. And that's the disappointing thing with that title, which is it's a title that sells, and yet what does it really mean? But to get back to your first thing, at the risk of enraging and alienating both of you, as a parallel.
Bring it on, Randy. Bring it on. We're ready.
Here we go. Dangerous territory here. But as a parallel, imagine the idea of looking at a naked person from a distance of the opposite gender or the same gender, no matter whatever your sexual orientation is. And at some distance, that vision is arousing. And yet, as you start to move in and closer and closer and closer, eventually you get to the point where you're looking at individual cells and the hairs on the body and things like that. That's no longer arousing. That's the parallel that comes to my mind with what you're talking about there, which is what is interesting. If you zoom in on the word interesting, you start trying to get analytical about it, then all of a sudden it loses its focus and you don't know what in the world you're talking about. But from a distance.
Well, is it neuroscience the ultimate in analytical?
I guess so. Exactly. It depends on what scale you take it to. Precisely. So
those things you want to define by behavior, right? If we are all going to get on board and say, well, what I mean by interest is this, and here are the characteristics of the story. And let's just say we could get the whole universe to agree on, we all are on board. This means interesting. Why aren't we just happy with that?
Well,
look for the behavior.
Part of what you're hitting on. Well, part of what you're hitting on right there is the very principle I'm propagating with this narrative gym and the ABT framework, which is that I don't like to talk much about story and storytelling because of that very reason. That draws in lots of big, intuitive, larger scale stuff. And what I've done is take the monomyth structure that Joseph Campbell identified and pointed out that he called it the ordinary world, the special world. What he should have labeled it as is the non-narrative world and the narrative world. And because the narrative is the bottom part of the journey where you establish the problem, it's the journey that you're trying to solve it. That's the visceral part of a story. So narrative is embedded within story, and story then brings all this extra stuff that makes it then so nebulous and large and holistic. And at some point, not very helpful for trying to communicate, but narrative we bring down to the problem solution dynamic, and that makes it much more analytical. And that's the power of what we're doing right now. And we're finding it, we're having great success with all these groups that we work with because they've been given this storytelling thing and found it frustrating, exactly like that, nebulous, and it goes on endlessly. But when they're given this problem solution dynamic, they see there's a power in that. And that's what, is at the core of what we're doing there. But story and storytelling, as you say, there is no science to it so far. And it's just a whole bunch of different things. And we know we love stories, but defining that. And then when you get into the humanities, as I have, and you talk to English professors and to communications professors, and you ask them, this is the whole start of a lot of this for me was, my improv guy, Brian Palermo, asking me, what's the difference in definition between the words story and narrative? And in the beginning, I told him, oh, you can't pull them apart. And he said, well, you kind of owe it to your readers to pull it apart. And then I started going and asking some of these professors in the humanities to give me two definitions, and verbatim over and over again, they said, you can't pull them apart. A story is a narrative, a narrative is a story. They don't think analytically like that. And that's a lot of the problem that we have, is that this is an analytical approach that helps a lot. That's why one of my soulmates from the humanities world is Jerry Graff with his book, They Say, I Say, which has sold over 2 million copies and is used in courses in comparative literature and rhetoric. And that book is about the use of templates in argumentation. And the title itself, They Say, I Say, is the and the but. So he gets this stuff. But then when you read that, he begins in his foreword talking about what he's had to endure from the humanities world, of people telling them this is too Mickey Mouse, it's too simple, templates ruin the world, blah, 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 blah. There's this whole opposition crowd. And then Park Howell has gotten a dose of this, being told that the ABT is reductionist and insulting. And I've been told the same thing on Twitter. People have come after me calling this reductionist, and you're ruining the world by boiling things down, sucking all the beauty out of it. And yet we end up with people beautifully confused, like that quote, in my opinion, of Steven Pinker there. And interestingly, I played that just a little while ago for Matt, our technician, and he's a fan of Pinker and all that sort of stuff. And to him, that quote was great. He totally got it. He's read all his books, and yeah, there he is talking about cognition, all these sorts of things. But to me, it's just blurs together. So
I think, anyone who says what you're doing, or what they say, I say is doing, or templates are ruining the world, doesn't understand what it's like to learn a skill. It's the classic in science, I guess, what we would call the degrees of freedom problem in cognitive psychology, which is like, you're learning a new skill. I'm not going to give you all the things at once. Right? If you're learning to swing a bat and hit a ball, Jen, you know what a softball bat is? I know you're in Australia, so okay.
Oh, good. I'm up with it.
Cricket bat. Okay. Right.
Cricket bats look like garage doors on sticks to me. I don't understand. But okay. So
they do the same thing, Maryanne. Just hit the ball. All good.
If you're learning to swing a bat, you give a little kid a bat, and you tell the kid, just swing the bat, kind of stand like this, blah. You don't walk around adjusting their elbow and doing this and move your foot and it's too complicated. They'll walk away. They'll completely walk away. So you give them just a few basic, a template, a few things, and then they refine the skill, and then it becomes smoother. This is in cognitive psychology. Your approach is what we would call, the template is what we would call a schema. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. So, and you're going to learn a basic schema with some broad ideas first, and then you're going to refine it, and it's going to become more and more refined over time. And that is the development of expertise. So all you're doing is taking something, not all you're doing. I mean, I don't mean to trivialize it, because it's profound. It's just straightforward. What you're doing is taking something that is complicated and giving people, for lack of a better expression, because I know this is a trendy expression, an on-ramp, right? Instead of just going, well, just learn it. You're giving them a way to learn it.
Yeah.
Same way that a good music teacher can teach you how to do, can break those skills down and help you understand them.
Well, okay.
Piano.
So to up the stakes here a bit, why not? Let's see if we can get a little more incendiary, because these things are important. My concern is that academia is going to wind itself into oblivion. That's so disconnected with society, and there's a lot of major people having these concerns nowadays. James Carville, the Democratic Party strategist, last spring did an interview in Vox in which he talked about faculty lounge politics and faculty lounge language, and said the Democratic Party is losing the general public because they're talking in terminology and this therapy speak, this very stuff, that the average people on the street can't understand what's going on there. And at the same time, not only did we just finish with a president for 4 years who spoke in very simple, blunt, ugly, unfortunate language that cut all corners and worked for them, but yesterday he gave a speech at the Iowa State Fair and basically said his message is simple: we're going to fix this thing. And there's the problem. That guy has got deep narrative intuition, like it or not. And when he got elected, and I was on Park Howell's podcast, and the discussion we did the morning after, turned out to be his most popular one for a couple of years because I talked about, I told you for a year, Trump has got this understanding of broad communication at the simplest of all levels. And it took a couple of years for a lot of the hardcore Democratic pundits to finally begin to concede the guy, he's not a good storyteller. That's the first misunderstanding of the very things we've talked about here. Ronald Reagan was a great storyteller. Trump has nothing about storytelling about him, but he's powerful with narrative, the problem solution dynamic. That's his entire thing. And he comes at it very simply by cheating the system, by lying, by scheming, by saying, here's the problem, here's our solution. And that's what he's telling them now. He's got a simple message coming in, another few years, the next election, he is going to run on, we're going to fix this damn thing. And an awful lot of average people are just going to connect with that attitude. It's the simplest of all levels. And that's what worries me, is a society in which the smarter people, in my opinion, end up being so bogged down by so much complicated terminology. And here's the ugly part, which is that I feel that an awful lot of that stuff comes from the world of psychology. That's what the therapy speak thing is about. And that's what's populating the language of the left into this non-functional language that ends up losing people. So now tell me to shut up.
I'm not telling you to shut up. I told you I don't think that it comes from the world of psychology. It comes from pseudopsychology. Just like, the world right now is filled with a bunch of armchair epidemiologists, right? Yeah. Other epidemiologists are like, why don't you just sit in your chair and let me, with your Excel spreadsheet and just disconnect yourself from the internet while I, a grown-up, try and figure out what's going on here. And that's what everyone I know who's a psychological scientist says the same thing. Why don't you stop hijacking language and acting like you know all about human behavior just because you have a mind? And some of you who know about therapy because you've been to therapy, you don't know what you're talking about. So the problem is psychology suffers, as a science, psychology suffers from a kind of permeable boundary with vocabulary, right? So we use words like anxiety and, so we use a word like anxiety, for instance, that means something in psychological science and means something different in sort of lay people speak. You don't have that problem, Randy, because what do people talk about in your area? Right? It's not cocktail party chatter, but it's cocktail party chatter, and so, and I find it really irritating. No one goes to the dentist and says, no, let me tell you which tooth is screwed, right? No one says that.
But I think there are other fields that suffer the same way, Maryanne. I've got a good friend who's a nutritionist, and she's like, just because you eat, it doesn't mean you're a nutritionist. Yeah, completely. And, but they'll take on the language because it's about me, so I own it. Yeah, but Randy didn't call out the dietitians. He called out the nutritionist. He called out the psychologist. So I'm having to go with him on behalf of my. But
that article from the New Yorker last spring was about therapy speak as a large scale phenomenon in our language. That's the author of that thing articulated exactly what I'm saying there, which is all these terms.
Yeah, except I read it and it drives me crazy because I feel like my science is being hijacked by people who think they know.
Okay, and so then my answer to you and to all of them comes down to one word. And Jen, do you know what the one word is?
Is it something I can pronounce?
You better be at this point.
Veridicality.
Yeah, no, veridicality. That's today's word of the day. The one word is narrative. And that's the bottom line. Of course. Yeah, it's just, you got to get better at this communication stuff. You can't sit there wringing your hands. I've had 15 years now of yelling this at the science world. This is what happened.
We're sitting there wringing our hands and not doing anything.
The whole science world is, I swear to God, they are digging themselves deeper.
I'm not in the whole science world. I'm in my science world.
Well, the National Academy of Sciences, which is pretty big and broad, and their initiative on communication is basically, the subtext of their initiative is basically, we're not going to talk about any communication principles unless they're peer reviewed. And that is the most nonsensical, just idiotic approach to the topic of communication, which is so rapidly evolving. It happens on a daily basis and involves so much of a visceral component that it's a great philosophy for research science and all the theory that goes with that. Of course, you don't want that stuff to be talked about unless it's been peer reviewed. But communication is a practical thing dealing with humans. And that's what they're doing. They're digging deeper and deeper and deeper into that. They're buying into all of the world of psychology, of cognition and values and framing and all this stuff that comes from the psychology world. And that's the bottom line, is that it's just getting more and more obfuscated. And let's see, Jen, as I understand, you're going to have to head off to something else, but don't worry, we've got a replacement for you. He's been waiting in the the matters.
I've got so many questions for Maryanne. I'm like, but that's all right, Maryanne. We can have you back, right? Because I got a lot
we
of
definitely
questions.
will.
Just contact me.
Yeah, this is an ongoing discussion. But to take your place in the on deck circle has been Doug Passon, who is a lawyer that's working with me now on the narrative gym book for law. So, Doug, you want to join us? I bet you got a few things to add to the conversation. I've seen a few comments you put in the chat window. Doug, you got anything you want to start with?
Am I here yet?
Yes, you're with us. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, great conversation. Second of all, thank you for having me. I was just looking forward to the fact that both you and Park have had everybody jump down your throat for trying to reduce this to a simple, a formula. And of course, that's kind of what we're aiming for in the legal community. So I'm very much looking forward to having a million lawyers attack me when this book comes out. But I am a firm believer in the ABT method.
Maryanne, can you give us some thoughts 2 years later since the visit that Jade and I did there and introduced ABT to your folks?
One of the things that we do we use it a lot in my lab. Like, I know that you've been hesitant to, I guess, bring grad students in too early because they, don't maybe have a appreciation for it, but we use it in the lab a lot. So we ask for the sentence, what's the ABT? We don't always call it that. But we give them a model and then say, until you can get your idea down into the sentence, you're not progressing.
Yeah.
Because at that point, actually, it's quite similar to the idea of until we can all get on board with what we mean by interest, we're not looking for it in the brain with fancy equipment.
Wait, slow that down. Say that again.
I think it's a similar kind of issue in that, until neuroscience, for instance, could define, until we get some kind of broad agreement about what we mean when we're using a word like interest or engagement, we're not going to go spend lots of money and with fancy equipment to go look for it in the brain, since we have no idea what we're doing. And it would be the same thing. Unless you can nail down the issue in a simple ABT statement, you're not progressing. You're not collecting data. You're not doing anything because you have it's not clear. So I think there's too much. It keeps students, for instance, from going off down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
They get super frustrated, but I don't care. They're going to get frustrated later. They'll get really frustrated when I find out they've spent a lot of my money collecting data that are rubbish.
Well, one of the things that we've been doing this course. One of your graduate students did the early round of the course, right? Was it Sarah?
And Andrea and Sarah. Yep.
Sarah. Yeah. Sarah. I remember. And the course is now in its 17th round. And it's really interesting because when you think about Doug, I think we need to have you mute your audio because it's echoing. When you think about a typical college course, it gets taught once a year, maybe twice a year. And it means if you want to do 17 iterations of that course, it's going to take you 17 years or something like that. This course of ours, we are now in the 17th round in just a year and a half. So we've been doing it month after month after month after month. And doing that, patterns have been slowly but surely emerging as we've gotten deeper into it. And one of the things that we're seeing, that pattern about younger students, that it takes time to develop the context of what you're doing. And that's just aging and maturation, things like that. And I don't think it's talked about enough, because when we've done this with high school kids with ABTs, what you find is they put the problem in the and material at the beginning because they don't know what context to set this thing up. I'm working on this and this and this. And it's with age. They don't have the and. They don't have the and. And that's what we've learned in this course. Was in the beginning last year when we did the round, I think Sarah was like in the second round. And back then we had a rule of thumb, which is, this and stuff, that's how you bore people. So probably the best thing you do is keep the and to the minimum, and maybe even the but kind of state it concisely. What everybody wants to hear is the therefore. So make the A and the B short, make the therefore real long. Well, as we've gone further and further with iteration after iteration, we've come to realize it's that opening material. It's the context. That is the challenge of everything. And that's the art that's involved in it. And that's what you get with the senior, like yourself. You're at a point in your career where you can look at these topics and questions and you can put them into context far better than any young people can, because you've got the big picture. And that's what you hear sometimes with the really senior states people. And I remember it as a young scientist being at departmental seminars, and some young scientists give a talk and everybody's debating about it in the Q&A. And then finally the senior scientist from the back of the room steps up and says, look, it's a matter of this and this. We've been studying this for 40 years. And everybody goes quiet, like, oh my God, and you know what I'm talking about with that, Maryanne?
Yeah. So are you saying that, now you've shifted away from a short and into really lay out the and?
The model we've now developed is a 3-step model for strengthening the ABT. And step 1 is you go right to the butt. And the first thing you want to do is make sure you know what your problem is. And you want to make sure it's singular as well, that you don't have 3 or 4 problems at once. And what we began to realize as we were doing these ABT builds over and over again was the number of people running big projects, hundreds of $1,000 grants. And you ask them, what's the core problem you're working on? And they just start to cast their eyes off, like, well, we're working on this, but it's also kind of about this, kind of this. And you realize they don't even know the central problem they're working on. You really can't do anything until you've got that crystal clear. But once you've got that down, then step 2 is now you can go backwards. Now you know exactly what you need in that opening stuff, the context. And that's how you end up getting something really efficient there. And you set things up, and there's 2 parts. There's the ordinary world you want to start with, just telling us what it is we're working on. And then the second thing is, why is this important? What's at stake? You want that right before the butt. And that opening stuff, if you can paint this perfect picture of the world, then on the butt is where you take it all away. And that's when you get the brain response. That's when you see in the fMRI, the brain suddenly activates, because you lulled us into this beautiful opening world of agreement. Like, yes, that's what I want. And then you say, but that's not what you've got right now. That's when you get the motivation there. And then immediately the person wants to advance the narrative. All right, therefore, what are we going to do? What's the consequence? So that's the third part, is once you establish those 2 elements, the end and the but, then the 2 moments, you fine tune those. But that's what's come out of over 500 of these ABT builds I've done now with the participants in the course, iteration after iteration. And we're getting there. But the fascinating thing there is that age dimension. And it's not that young people are stupid. Bill Maher is fond of saying that. He said it a number of times on his show. Well, young people are stupid. They shouldn't be in charge of anything. It's not that. It's that it takes time for the brain to mature and to develop the experience and to understand the context of what you're doing. And I think the more that students can be made aware of that, you've got this challenge and you'll get there. But know that it just needs attention to figure out what it is that you're doing. Because you know that syndrome that students get assigned a problem and they don't quite even know, why are you sequencing this gene? Well, I was told by the professor to sequence it, and figuring out context. Any of that make sense?
Yeah, it all makes sense. Again, I'm sad I'm agreeing with you.
Can't we argue about something here? We've got about 10 minutes left.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because there's something that happens as you get, more and more advanced in your discipline, where you're really interested in the history of your discipline, or just history in general, right?
Wait, say more on that.
Well, it's like, the bread and butter of every graduate course is the history of your discipline, right? So in psychology, it's like history and systems in psychology. And then when you take that, if you're a nerd and you're interested in it, if it comes at the right time, what you realize is that a lot of scientific thought has not advanced very much since the time of the ancient Greeks, right? It just hasn't. There's a lot of dualism and a lot of blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. But if that comes too soon, then all that happens is your eyes glaze over. Like, for some reason, a lot of introductory psychology textbooks, psychology is a survey course at intro level, right? 100 level. Start off with history of psychology. Who cares? It's completely without context. They're 18. They don't appreciate it. You're still what you really are trying to do is spring on them. This is not about ESP. I'm sorry to tell you, this is an actual science course. And then you hit them with this history and they don't have any appreciation for it. It should come later. And the history and the systems.
Awesome. Okay. Wait a second. Doug and I were just having this discussion this morning. Wasn't this the same thing we were talking about, Doug? I was telling you, in our course, our ABT course, we've had different parts of it that we thought needed to be the first session. And then we come to the same thing you're talking about. We've come to realize, wait a second, this blows by people in the first session. And one of the fascinating things that happens in our course now is we have 10 sessions and 5 of them are from guest lecturers, and they do them each time. Most of them have done about 10 or 12 times at least. And Nancy Knowlton, who's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, gives the last one. And the first time she gave it, half of her whole talk was introductory material. And as I listened to it the first time through, I thought, oh my God, this should have been our very first one at the beginning of the course. Well, what happened that day was a whole bunch of people wrote in notes saying, I've been semi-confused through much of this course. And by getting that introductory lecture as the last one, that was the moment where all these things came together and synthesized. And it's kind of cool. And it's still now, this week will be the end of the 17th round, and she's giving the last one, and we'll get the same thing. And we end up, people type in the chat room, we would do a standing ovation if we could stand up in Zoom, because her introductory lecture as the final lecture ends up synthesizing all this stuff that we realize, it's a lot we're going through, and people are still trying to put the pieces together. And then suddenly this introductory thing. And you're the same thing. Doug, what do you think about her saying that history should be later on?
I agree, because I think that was my struggle when we talked about the fact that I was just inundating people with so much information, that I want to talk about Aristotle and poetics and McKee and all these things that I think are laying this wonderful foundation, when in reality it's probably just confusing the heck out of people right out of the gate. So I think there's value in getting right to it, and then maybe weaving that in as you go.
That's really deep and profound. And this has never quite dawned on me. And it's very, very relevant, because Patricia Limerick is one of our 5 instructors. She's a MacArthur Fellow. She's the co-founder of the American Center for the American West at University of Colorado, one of the top historians of the West in the United States. And she's going to be writing the history version of this book with me. And these will be deep discussions I'll be having with her. What about this idea that history, yes, it's very, very important, but maybe it works better a little further down the road. You want to say anything further on that, Maryanne? That's really interesting. I had never thought about that.
Well, it goes to I think, a well-established principle in cognitive psych, which is whether you go from specific to abstract or abstract to specific, right? And history too soon is too abstract. You have nothing to connect it to, nothing to hang on to, none of the, as you would say, template knowledge, none of the scaffolding, none of that on board. And so it's irrelevant. Swatted, why am I doing this? Blah, blah, blah. So I think it's much more powerful to start with the concrete, and then you can put it in a context as you accrue more and more concrete, specific knowledge.
That's very, very cool. We accomplished something with this discussion. We're about out of time.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, no, but that's really great. I was wondering, are we going to get to something really interesting, different, at least for me? That revelation that you've just shared there, that is so profound. You're right. Every topic wants to begin with history. There's just a natural intuition that, we got to begin by telling them all about the past, and then they'll build us up to the present, and then we'll start in on the topic. And I think you're right. Let's start giving them the topic. And once they get a feel for it, then they'll find it interesting to learn where this all came from and some of that stuff.
Yeah. Also, I think it goes back to this thing I was saying about the kids, right? I want to tell you all about the history of how we got here, because really what it means is the history of how I got here. And you don't care about that, right? So it's really about, this is not, when you're trying to communicate to people, you're not reading your journal to them. Yeah. You're trying to teach.
Sorry. And my hope is, I refer to the ABT as a gateway drug. My hope is when I give this to people, they're just going to be so into it that then they're going to want to go and dig in and read Story by McKee and do that, know.
And I think that's very true, because it lights a fire when for the first time ever, they can, first off, grasp a little bit of what story structure is about. And then secondly, one of the very cool things that has come from Patty Limerick, I've been working with her for about 6 months now with a lot of her historians and graduate students in history there. We've done a number of workshops, and she reports back to me, one of the coolest things she sees is self-confidence, that when people begin to see some clarity in their big complicated topic, and they can boil it down to something simple that's explainable, that translates into confidence themselves of being able to say, I actually kind of do feel like I know this topic, as opposed to I've got this giant ball of information that I'm not quite sure how it all goes together. And we see that with the course as well. And I think that's really essential in the world of law, right? Is you really need these people to be persuasive advocates. And that confidence.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Note to ourselves, you know what? You don't have that in chapter 7 yet, do you? About confidence, self-confidence.
No.
Yeah, let's make a note about
if
that.
That's a thing with lawyers. We seem to at least pretend we have lots of confidence.
Well, it's very deep because it digs right into those arc plot characteristics that's in McKee's book, and item number 4 in those is complete causality. This is what mass audiences listen for. They want to hear the omniscient narrator, the confident voice that really knows the story backwards and forwards. They don't want to ever hear any shortage of confidence in the narrator. And by the way, the former president knew this to a T and used it to his advantage. And, he bluffed his confidence. But the confidence thing is an unavoidable characteristic of effective communication. And there's just nothing much you can do about that. And hopefully you can gain the confidence through genuinely having reason to be confident, which is that you understand the core of what you're talking about, which is the ABT. So that's let's talk some more about that for the law side, because I think that's
well, and real quick, we talked about the 3 C's that this is going to give lawyers. Credibility is the first one, and confidence is credibility, and confidence go hand in hand. The other is control. The other is control, which we love more than anything, and the other is that connection, that emotional connection. So that fits. That's good. Thanks.
Excellent.
I'll add that.
Okie dokie. And we are winding down. Maryanne, are we about to say something?
I was just going to say, since Doug's a lawyer and he said he knows Elizabeth Loftus's work, I was just going to say, I could, teach students all about memory, which is one of the oldest areas in psychological science, well over 100 years old. By taking them, I could start with the Greeks. I could start with the British philosophers. I could start anywhere. I could start 100 years ago in Germany. I could start with theory and mechanism. Or I could say, suppose when you leave class today, you walk outside the building and you see somebody get hit in the crosswalk. What are you going to do? Right? Are you going to go into your separate little room and not talk to anybody else, which is what you should be doing until the police show up? Or are you going to talk to other people and say, did you see that? And then I start building a story about how they're going to mislead each other. And then after learning that phenomena about how memories distort, then eventually they'll become interested in learning more about that. And then we can back out eventually into theory and mechanism and history and stuff like that. So that's what I mean. You grab people early on and they'll be happy to learn about where and why.
That's very, very cool. And on that note, I just realized over your head are all the lamb chops.
Yeah.
That's great. And one of the main reasons I begged you to join us here in this conversation, because you are such a good communicator. And is it your New Jersey upbringing or something? You speak in very plain, straightforward language, as opposed to lots of academics I know who really do speak in circles. I guess. I mean, I just try to explain in a way that other people, like in my family, if you didn't make sense at the dinner table, someone would call you stunad, which is stupid. So there you go. And that's the version of stupid. And it also carried with it implicit shut up. All of which takes us full circle into the world of veridicity, or what was the term?
Veridicality.
Veridicality. Sorry. Okay. Yeah.
It was really hard as someone from New Jersey not to drop I just refer to the ABT model as the ABT F model.
Therefore, fuck it.
It was really hard not to drop my own flair into this chat.
Nice. Cool. All right. Well, thank you for self-censoring all your foul language. And really appreciate the time. Doug, thanks very much. You and I'll be talking again in a few days as we're slaving away on this book. You betcha.
Nice to meet you, Doug. Happy to talk anytime if you like.
Great. So nice to meet you too, Maryanne. You guys take care.
All right. We will keep in touch. Thanks, Maryanne. Tell everybody there howdy, and maybe we'll come back to Hamilton someday. All right. Bye. Thanks. Bye-bye.